First to speak is Johan Anderberg. Johan is a Swedish writer and journalist who's been a regular contributor to a number of Swedish and international media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal. His recent book, The Herd, highlights Sweden's experience of the COVID-19 pandemic. Johan, you have the ears of the House.
Mr. President, Madam President, sorry. I just copied someone else's opening. Members of this union, thank you for inviting me here. So in proposing this motion, I would like to go back 2.5 years. In March of 2020, when a new virus from China spread in Europe, a few old men in Stockholm started writing emails to each other. What was going on, they asked. That question wasn't so much directed at the virus itself, but at the different measures that experts and policymakers around Europe now took. These experts, for some reason, stopped kids from going to school. They closed bars and restaurants. They made politicians go deep in debt, mortgaging generations to come, just because they were under the impression that some perfect mix of policy proposals could keep the virus at bay. Man, this was crazy, they thought. There was no way that this Chinese solution of shutting down society would work here in Europe, or in China for that matter. These emailers would eventually get pretty famous around the world, as they were the ones that decided what Sweden would do during the pandemic. Perhaps you remember their names, Anders Tegnell, and so on. And perhaps you remember what they did. Almost nothing. They refused to lock down society. They kept preschools and most schools open. They didn't force masks on anyone. They pretty much relied on people's common sense. So how did it go? I'll tell you in a bit, but let's stay in 2020 for just a little while. Because what we had here was a massive experiment. It was not a perfectly designed one, for sure, but still. So we have lots of countries on this side, like masking up, closing schools, and one country doing nothing. We have a control group. So you think that the pandemic experts of the world, as well as journalists, would have welcomed this, that they would have taken an objective interest in how it's going. So you just follow what was going on. That's not quite how it turned out. Instead, a host of prestigious newspapers and TV channels from all around the world came to Sweden and sent back stories that described the country as something of a populist nation turning its back on science. Of course, the people in charge of this alternative strategy, they were scientists too. Experts, if you will. They just had a different opinion. They just interpreted the facts in a different way. So, who was right? Was it the thousands of experts around the world who condemned the strategy? Or was it these stubborn old men, these emailers, who preferred to rely on people's common sense?
One point of information.
Yep.
Sweden had double the number of deaths of comparable countries, including Denmark and Norway. And if you try and compare it to apples-for-apples countries with the UK, for example, Sweden had much better health infrastructure. Sweden also had to row back on many of its policy decisions in autumn 2020, when it realised it was facing existential crisis. So don't you think this is actually manipulation of the data? And if you look at comparable socioeconomic countries to Sweden, you can see substantially worse outcomes and excess deaths far beyond what was necessary.
Do you think Germany is a socioeconomic comparable country to Sweden? Do you think Germany is comparable to Sweden?
In terms of sort of healthcare metrics, no. But I think basically Finland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden are quite a good socioeconomic comparison.
I'll address these things in a bit. Well, thank you. Okay, so when Eurostat measured excess mortality for the whole of 2020, Sweden ended up in 22nd place out of 30 countries. If Sweden was a US state, it would rank 43 of the 50 states. And when the World Health Organization recently summarized 2 years of the pandemic, it turned out that Sweden had around half the average excess death rate compared to UK, Germany, Spain, and Italy. Of course, Denmark, Finland, and Norway has slightly lower death rates. But still, when you look at Denmark, was actually also one of the more open countries in Europe. Would you agree on that? These numbers haven't been widely reported, which is understandable. All those experts, all those journalists, all those pundits who cheered the lockdowns on are, of course, reluctant to realize that millions of people lived unfree for nothing. Millions of kids and young adults, many of you also, had their education disrupted, all for nothing. And experts at Britain's own Imperial College, whose predictions for the Swedish death toll had been wrong by 2,000%, were suddenly very quiet. In a way, it isn't too surprising how it all played out. After all, it was experts who dug down in Vietnam. It was experts who created the banking rules that brought the world economy to the brink of collapse in 2008. It was experts who printed all that money that caused the massive inflation that we're now living through.
One information. Isn't this just an argument for better expertise? I was in Sweden in 2020 at the time, and I wouldn't say that there were no COVID restrictions. There were restrictions on very large gatherings, which stayed non-pandemic, unlike what was present in the UK, which went open and closed down and open. It seemed like, to me, being in Sweden, like it was a place of very good expertise and not a place that ignored expertise.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think that the whole thing is that you shouldn't trust experts too much. Like these experts, many of these experts weren't just looking at epidemiology. Many of them were talking about how this would affect restaurants and so on. So they were the ones that took a more holistic approach. So it's definitely possible for experts to do this as well. But I think it would be easier for politicians to do that.
Point of information.
Yeah.
You said the people who caused inflation were experts that we shouldn't listen to. Are you referring to Boris Johnson distrust as experts?
I don't think Boris Johnson was the one that started printing money in 2008. The thing here is that there is nothing divine about expert knowledge. The unwillingness to admit mistakes made during COVID show that experts and scientists are just as unwilling to change opinions in light of new facts as anyone else is. Experts also have careers to protect, mortgages to pay. They are subject to the same mental fallacies as we all are. So the problem isn't perhaps experts, but the belief that they can somehow transcend politics. That is why we should welcome the uprising against expert rule, not just brand it as populism or as anti-science, but see it as part of our democracy. And for that reason, I commend this motion to the House. Thank you.